The sound of clinking glasses and laughter echoed through the grand ballroom, but in a corner of the room, Nathaniel Ward stood in complete silence. The heir to Ward Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar empire, was surrounded by wealth and opulence, but no one dared to approach him. The whispers were louder than any sound. The billionaire's deaf son. Too much of a puzzle to fix. Too different to be understood. But that night, for the first time in his life, someone saw him. Not as a disability or a son to be fixed, but as a person. Before we dive into this intense story, please follow our channel for more thrilling narratives like this one. Now, sit back and enjoy every twist and turn. The ballroom glittered like a scene from a fairy tale. Chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, bathed in soft golden light, illuminating the shimmering gowns and tuxedos of the city's elite. Rich businessmen, socialites, and celebrities mingled effortlessly, their voices blending into an orchestra of affluence. Yet, amidst the noise and grandeur, Nathaniel Ward stood still, almost invisible. His black tuxedo was tailored to perfection, fitting his athletic frame with ease. But his expression, a quiet frown, eyes distant, betrayed a loneliness that no wealth could fill. The air around him buzzed with conversation, yet he was nothing more than a figure in the background, locked in the silent world of his own. Nathaniel's father, Robert Ward, had always ensured his legacy was protected, but that legacy had a price. Nathaniel's silence. His deafness, a part of him no one in this high society world truly understood, had turned him into an enigma. A brilliant heir whose worth was measured only by his ability to conform. And yet, tonight, as always, no one seemed to look past his silence. The rich danced around him, talking at him, but never to him. He had come to expect the isolation, the pity, the patronizing smiles. They whisper that I'm broken, a project to be fixed, he thought bitterly. But none of them truly saw him. And then, in a room full of chatter and clinking glasses, someone finally did. Olivia Clark had never belonged to this world. She was a waitress, an outsider, only here because she had a job to do. Yet as she navigated the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, her gaze kept returning to Nathaniel. She noticed something others hadn't. The way he stood alone, distant, his eyes searching for something he couldn't find among the glittering guests. She had seen that look before, the look of someone who was invisible in a world that only valued appearances. And it tugged at something in her, something she couldn't ignore. Tonight, she couldn't just blend into the background. This wasn't just another event. She could feel that. So, when her shift brought her near him, Olivia couldn't help but stop. And for the first time in the entire evening, she didn't simply serve him. She reached out, not with words, but with a language he would understand. She signed the simple question, "Are you okay?" Nathaniel blinked, startled. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not in a way that acknowledged the silence he lived with. It wasn't pity. It wasn't a gentle attempt to fix him. It was just a simple, real connection. As their eyes met, the walls Nathaniel had built over years of isolation began to crumble. And for the first time, he felt the sting of loneliness fade. Olivia didn't know why she had been drawn to him. She was just a waitress, trying to make it through her evening without being noticed by the wealthiest guests. But something about Nathaniel's presence, his isolation, spoke to her. She wasn't someone who often ventured outside her place in the world, but tonight was different. She didn't just want to observe him, as everyone else did. She wanted to see him. And as their connection grew through a simple exchange of signs, Olivia began to realize that this was more than just a chance encounter. For Nathaniel, it was a chance to break free from the suffocating world that had never truly let him live. For Olivia, it was a glimpse into a life beyond the walls she had always accepted. But as the night progressed, so did the obstacles. Robert Ward, Nathaniel's father, was watching, disapproving of his son's behavior. The pressure to conform would soon grow unbearable for both of them. Nathaniel would have to decide whether to follow his father's expectations or to embrace a connection that had made him feel, for the first time, like he truly belonged. Nathaniel stood still, his heart racing in the silence of the ballroom, as Olivia's hands moved gracefully through the air. Her fingers danced in the familiar rhythm of American Sign Language, spelling out words that Nathaniel had never expected to hear in such a place. Words that didn't carry pity, nor an attempt to fix him. "Are you okay?" The simplicity of her question, the way she looked at him not with sympathy but with genuine curiosity, shattered the walls he'd so carefully constructed. His entire life, he had been taught to retreat into silence, to wear a mask of indifference. But in this moment, Olivia had peeled back the layers, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. He blinked, trying to process the shock of being seen. "Me?" he thought, bewildered. No one ever asked him that. Not really. His father's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him to keep his silence, to be the model heir to Ward Enterprises. But Olivia's presence felt like a breath of fresh air. The suffocating weight of expectation had loosened its grip, just for a moment. Nathaniel lifted his hand slowly, uncertain, but he signed back. "Yes. I'm fine." It felt strange, like breaking a rule. The fluid motion of his fingers seemed to speak a truth he had long buried, and for the first time in years, he wasn't pretending. Olivia smiled, genuine, warm, and completely unpracticed in the way she typically smiled in the company of her wealthier patrons. This wasn't a performance. It wasn't the polite nod she had given to countless strangers before. She had just connected with him. She had reached him through the one language that didn't require words. "Nice to meet you," she signed, her movements slow and careful, not wanting to overwhelm him. Nathaniel's lips parted slightly, his eyes scanning her face for any hint of mockery or pity, but all he saw was sincerity. She didn't look at him like a puzzle to be solved or a tragedy to overcome. She just saw him. For a brief moment, Nathaniel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. It flickered like a candle in the darkness, tiny but bright. But as quickly as the moment had come, doubt crept in. Nathaniel turned his gaze toward the crowd. His father, Robert Ward, stood across the room, engaging in a conversation with a group of investors, his sharp, calculating gaze sweeping over the room. Nathaniel's heart sank. He knew the expectations his father had for him. Silent, composed, a perfect image of the Ward legacy. Nathaniel had been taught to hide his difference, to never let anyone see that he was anything less than perfect. And here, for the first time, he had let someone in. Olivia saw the shift in his expression, the way his shoulders tensed as he glanced toward his father. She didn't need to be told who he was. She had overheard enough of the conversations swirling around the room to piece it together. Nathaniel Ward, the heir to one of the most powerful empires in the world. But now, as she stood there, watching him withdraw again, she realized something she hadn't fully grasped before. Nathaniel's silence wasn't just a product of his deafness. It was a prison, one he had built for himself out of fear of being exposed. The brief connection between them was a glimmer of something real, something untouched by the world of status and wealth. But Nathaniel, ever the dutiful son, was already pulling away. Olivia felt the familiar pang of uncertainty. She didn't belong in this world, and Nathaniel, with his perfect tuxedo and weary eyes, certainly didn't belong in hers. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was unfolding between them. She had seen it in his eyes when he first signed back to her, I'm fine." The words weren't just a reassurance, they were a plea for understanding. And she couldn't ignore it. As the evening wore on, the weight of their interaction settled in both their minds. Nathaniel tried to lose himself in the sea of guests, but he couldn't stop thinking about Olivia. How effortlessly she had communicated with him. How she hadn't tried to fix him. It was the first time someone had treated him like a person, not an object to be corrected. But the more he thought about it, the more the walls he had spent years building began to close in again. His father's voice loomed in the background, reminding him that this wasn't the way to behave. "You have responsibilities, Nathaniel. You can't be weak." He glanced back toward Olivia, who was now serving drinks to a nearby table, her expression neutral, but with an undercurrent of something. Curiosity, perhaps, or sympathy. Nathaniel didn't know which one unsettled him more. He was used to being alone, used to the silence. It was the only thing he could control in a world that demanded so much from him. Olivia, too, was struggling. She had always prided herself on her ability to blend in, to be the unnoticed server, the invisible cog in the wheel of the elite. But tonight had shaken something loose inside her. Nathaniel wasn't like the others. He wasn't just a son of wealth, he was a person, caught in the crossfire of his family's expectations, of a world that had no place for him. The whispers had started, of course. The others in the staff had noticed her interaction with Nathaniel, and they hadn't hesitated to remind her of her place. "You shouldn't get too close to someone like him," one of the waiters had said with a knowing glance. "He's not like us. You're just a waitress. He's royalty." Olivia felt the sting of their judgment, but she refused to back down. It wasn't just about Nathaniel. It was about the opportunity to be seen, to experience something beyond the narrow life she had carved for herself. This wasn't just about a man and a woman in a ballroom. It was about the raw, unfiltered truth of their existence. Silent, complicated, and somehow, in that fleeting moment, connected. Despite the pressure from all sides, Olivia made a decision that night. She wouldn't pull away. She couldn't. For the first time, someone had treated her like she mattered, like her presence wasn't a formality or a job, but a meaningful part of someone else's story. And Nathaniel? Nathaniel deserved more than the suffocating world his father had built around him. Olivia knew there would be consequences, but for once, they didn't seem as important as the connection she had begun to forge with the man behind the silence. She walked through the ballroom with her head high, her mind made up. This is worth the risk. The hours slipped by unnoticed as Nathaniel and Olivia continued to exchange quiet words in sign language. What had started as a simple greeting blossomed into something deeper, a connection that neither of them had anticipated. Each moment they shared felt like an unraveling thread, pulling away the layers of formality that separated them from the world around them. Nathaniel found himself drawn to her in a way he hadn't experienced in years. She was different from the others, the women who smiled at him with practiced politeness, or the men who nodded at him out of obligation. Olivia wasn't pretending. She wasn't trying to smooth over the rough edges of his silence, or hide it behind a mask of empty sympathy. Instead, she seemed to see him in his entirety. The man beneath the air, the person beneath the legacy. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so seen. It was as if Olivia had pierced the armor he had worn for so long, and now, for the first time in ages, he was able to breathe. The conversations they had, while simple and brief, were filled with an unspoken understanding. The way she listened to him, the way her eyes softened when he signed, made him feel like he mattered. To her, he wasn't just the rich son of Robert Ward. He was someone to talk to, someone whose thoughts and feelings could be expressed freely. They exchanged more than just pleasantries. Nathaniel talked about his childhood, his passion for architecture, and the weight of his father's expectations. Olivia spoke of her life as a waitress and her struggles to balance school and work. She talked about her dreams, the things that kept her up at night, the future she was working toward. Nathaniel admired her honesty. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, everyone wore a mask. But Olivia was real. And that was something Nathaniel couldn't ignore. It was in the quiet moments between words, the way their hands moved effortlessly through the air, that the true depth of their connection began to unfold. There was no need to speak louder, no need to fill the air with the noise of pleasantries. They simply communicated, with grace and ease, in a language that no one else in the room seemed to understand. And in that silence, Nathaniel found peace, a peace he had never known in the chaotic world of his family's empire. Olivia, too, was starting to realize that something profound had shifted between them. She had never been the type to get involved with anyone from Nathaniel's world. She was just a waitress, a student trying to make it. But in Nathaniel, she saw a vulnerability she recognized. He wasn't the polished, untouchable heir to a fortune. He was a man trapped in a gilded cage, suffocating under the weight of expectations he hadn't asked for. Her heart went out to him, not because he was rich or powerful, but because he was lost. In a world full of superficial interactions and empty gestures, Nathaniel was one of the few people she had met who wasn't pretending. His authenticity made him stand out in a room full of fakes, and it was something that captivated her. But as the evening continued, the weight of the world Nathaniel was trying to escape began to creep in again. The pressure from his father, the relentless demands of his legacy, were never far from his mind. As the guests around them chatted and laughed, he felt himself slipping back into the role he had been assigned, the perfect heir, the silent son. He couldn't help but glance toward his father, who was surrounded by a group of influential businessmen, his demeanor cold and commanding. The more Nathaniel observed Robert Ward, the more he realized how trapped he was. His father didn't care about his happiness, his dreams, or his desires. All that mattered was the legacy, the empire that Nathaniel had been born to inherit. Nathaniel had tried for years to meet those expectations, to be the son his father wanted him to be. But now, standing in this room with Olivia, something inside him began to stir. He wanted out. He wanted to be free. But as the night wore on, the pressures mounted. Grant Hayes, Nathaniel's ever-watchful personal assistant, was always lurking nearby, his sharp eyes following Nathaniel and Olivia's every move. Grant didn't need to speak to make his disapproval clear. His cold gaze was enough to remind Olivia of her place in this world. She was just a server, someone who should know her limits. "You shouldn't be so familiar with him," Grant said to her in a low voice as she passed him, his words dripping with condescension. "It's inappropriate." Olivia bristled at his tone, but she didn't back down. She had felt the weight of the whispers in the room, the subtle judgment from the other staff members, but she refused to let it silence her. Nathaniel wasn't some figurehead to be ignored. He was a person, and she wasn't going to treat him like anyone else did, like a ghost in a suit. But as she returned to her duties, she couldn't help but feel the weight of Grant's words. The walls between her and Nathaniel, between their worlds, were growing higher. She was being warned to stay in her place. And while she knew she could never belong to Nathaniel's world, part of her didn't want to leave him there, alone in his silence. Nathaniel, too, felt the pressure. He had always lived in his father's shadow, a shadow that stretched long over everything he did. As the evening continued, he began to wonder if the connection he felt with Olivia was real, or if it was just a fleeting moment in a world that had no space for him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't want this to be fleeting. The idea of returning to the emptiness he had known for so long, of retreating back into his father's world where he was expected to perform and conform, felt suffocating. Olivia had shown him a glimpse of something different, and for the first time, Nathaniel wasn't sure if he could go back to the way things were. As he watched her move through the room, his heart ached with the weight of the decision he would soon have to make. The world he knew would never accept his connection with her. But for the first time in his life, Nathaniel felt like he had a choice, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to give it up. The air in the grand ballroom was thick with tension as Olivia walked back to the kitchen, her steps quick, purposeful, but weighed down by the silent judgment of the other staff members. Whispers followed her, but none of them carried the lightness of curiosity. Instead, they were sharp, critical, warnings. She could feel the eyes of the higher-ups on her, the subtle disapproval from those who didn't think a waitress belonged in a world where only the wealthy held power. Her supervisor's words echoed in her mind. "Keep your distance from Nathaniel. It's inappropriate." He had said it in a way that made her feel small, reminding her of her place in this grand theater of wealth and privilege. Olivia had never cared much for her place in the world. She had always been on the outside, never quite fitting into any mold. But tonight, the weight of her supervisor's reprimand felt different, heavier. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had simply spoken to Nathaniel, treated him like a person, not a label. And yet, the very act of showing him kindness had earned her a reprimand. The rules were clear. She wasn't to connect with him. She wasn't to make him feel seen. She wasn't to step out of her designated role. Olivia's chest tightened with frustration. She was used to being invisible, but this felt different. This wasn't just about doing her job. It was about something more, something deeper. Nathaniel wasn't like the other guests. He wasn't an untouchable figure, an object to be observed and whispered about. He was a man, just like anyone else. But for the first time, Olivia had been told her connection with him wasn't allowed. As she moved toward the service door, she caught sight of Nathaniel once more. He stood by the fireplace, his tall frame leaning against the marble pillar, staring into the fire with a detached expression. He looked the same as he always did, alone, aloof, distant. But there was something about him tonight, something different. Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that he too was feeling the weight of the evening. Nathaniel felt her presence before he saw her. His gaze flickered in her direction, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked across the room. His heart gave a strange, unexpected lurch. It was as if, in that instant, he could see the struggle behind her composed face, the conflict between wanting to help him and the fear of crossing the invisible line drawn by the world around them. But the connection between them wasn't something he knew how to handle. He had spent so much of his life hiding behind the silence, behind the walls of his father's expectations, that the sudden, unfiltered attention from Olivia made him feel exposed. She didn't pity him. She didn't treat him as broken. She simply saw him, and that terrified him. He had spent years building a shield around his emotions, a shield that allowed him to live in the world of privilege without truly being a part of it. But Olivia had pierced that shield, and now, with her kindness and her presence, he was beginning to wonder if he could even go back to the way things were. His mind raced, battling with the questions that had begun to gnaw at him. Was this real? Was this connection between them something genuine? Or was it just another fleeting moment in the loneliness that had been his life? For a moment, he let himself entertain the thought of a different life. A life where he wasn't the invisible son of Robert Ward, where he wasn't bound by the suffocating expectations of his family. A life where he could simply be Nathaniel. But then the doubt crept in. Could he truly leave all of this behind? Could he trust Olivia, someone who was just passing through his world, someone who might not understand the weight of the legacy he carried? His frustration swelled, and with it a growing sense of vulnerability that he wasn't used to. It wasn't just the pressure from his father or the judgment from the guests. It was the realization that he didn't know how to navigate this new reality with Olivia. She had made him feel seen, something he hadn't felt in years. But what did that mean for him? For them? Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin, Nathaniel found a quiet corner near the grand staircase. His father had been busy with investors, his usual conversations filled with self-assurance and calculated words. Nathaniel had slipped away from the noise, needing a moment of solitude. As he leaned against the marble banister, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He didn't have to turn around to know it was Olivia. There was something in the way her presence lingered in the room, a comfort, a warmth he hadn't expected to feel. She stopped a few feet away from him, her gaze fixed on him, yet not demanding anything. It was the same look she had given him earlier, genuine, without expectation. Nathaniel finally turned to face her. "I'm sorry," he signed, his hands slow, as though he wasn't sure how to express the depth of his feelings. "I'm not used to this." Olivia's eyes softened, and she shook her head slightly. "There's nothing to apologize for." For a moment, the silence between them stretched out, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding. "I've spent my whole life in silence," Nathaniel signed, his fingers trembling slightly. "People talk around me, but no one really sees me. They either pity me or they don't care. And now, with you, I don't know what to do." Olivia stepped closer, her heart aching for him. She hadn't expected him to open up, not like this. But in the quiet of the moment, with only the faint music from the ballroom filling the background, Nathaniel's walls began to crack, piece by piece. "You don't have to do anything," Olivia signed back gently, her movements careful, giving him space to breathe. "You don't have to hide. I'm not here to fix you, Nathaniel. I'm just here to listen." Her words settled around him like a blanket. For the first time in his life, he felt like he could speak the truth, even in silence. His hands moved, trembling slightly as he continued. "I've always been told who I should be, what I should do. I don't even know who I am anymore." Olivia's heart tightened. He had spent his entire life trapped in his father's world, molded into something he wasn't. He had never had the freedom to discover himself, to find out what truly made him happy. "You are more than your father's heir," Olivia signed back, her hands steady, her voice unspoken but clear. "You are who you choose to be." Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he felt like he could believe her. For the first time, the weight of his father's expectations didn't feel so heavy. It was just him now, standing in the quiet, with someone who saw him for who he truly was. The world outside continued to spin, but for Nathaniel and Olivia, the silence was all that mattered. And in that silence, they found something far more powerful than the noise of wealth and legacy: understanding. The glittering facade of the Ward family empire began to feel like a prison to Nathaniel. And as the days passed, the weight of his father's expectations grew heavier. Robert Ward had always prided himself on control over his business, control over his public image, and most importantly, control over his son. Nathaniel had always been the dutiful son, doing what was expected of him, staying silent, staying in line. But with each passing moment spent with Olivia, that silence was beginning to feel like a betrayal to himself. It wasn't just the whispering disapproval of the socialites or the cold glances from Grant Hayes, his father's ever-watchful assistant, that gnawed at him. It was the subtle, insidious feeling that something fundamental was changing. Olivia had entered his world, and for the first time, he wasn't hiding. But now, the very act of being seen, by her, by anyone, was becoming dangerous. Nathaniel could feel it in the air the moment his father began to pay attention. Robert, in his meticulously tailored suits, his demeanor always sharp and calculating, had grown more observant, more focused on his son's every move. Nathaniel was no longer just the quiet heir to Ward Enterprises. He was a son in defiance, and that was something Robert Ward could not and would not tolerate. It started with small comments. Robert's voice, thick with disapproval, slipping into Nathaniel's world when he least expected it. "I see you've been spending time with that waitress," Robert had said one evening, his tone cold, detached. "Is that really how you intend to conduct yourself, Nathaniel? Publicly fraternizing with someone of her station?" Nathaniel had stared back, the familiar tightness in his chest creeping up. The idea of spending time with Olivia, talking with her, being with her, had never felt more natural. But in his father's eyes, it was a stain on the family name, a mistake that had to be corrected. "She's a person, not an inconvenience," Nathaniel had said, his voice firm despite the knot in his stomach. "You don't understand," Robert had snapped. "This isn't just about you, Nathaniel. It's about the family name. You have responsibilities. You're an heir, not a charity case. Your actions reflect on everything we've worked for." Nathaniel had wanted to argue, wanted to tell his father that he wasn't some trophy or legacy to be polished. But the words caught in his throat. How could he explain to Robert, someone who had never cared to understand, that for once he wanted to be seen as something other than his father's puppet? That Olivia, in her quiet way, had given him something more valuable than any business deal or perfect image. She had given him his voice, his humanity. But Robert didn't care about that. All he cared about was control. The pressure from Robert escalated quickly. Meetings with investors, gala events, and even family gatherings became minefields for Nathaniel. He could feel his father's gaze on him at every turn, each moment laced with the expectation to fall in line, to abandon Olivia and return to the world his father had carved out for him. "It's time to end this," Robert had insisted one evening, his voice low and menacing. "This attachment to the waitress. It's beneath you, Nathaniel. You need to sever ties. Now." The words hung in the air like a threat, one that Nathaniel couldn't ignore. Severing ties with Olivia wasn't just a demand. It was a declaration of war. His father was giving him an ultimatum. Olivia or everything else. Nathaniel's pulse quickened, his thoughts a whirlwind. Olivia was the first person in his life who hadn't looked at him as a problem to be fixed. She had reached into the deepest parts of him, parts that he thought had long since been buried under the weight of his legacy. How could he simply walk away from that? From her? But Robert had never been one to give in. "This is not just a family matter," he had said. "It's a matter of the public eye, Nathaniel. You can't afford to be seen as weak, as someone who can't control his personal life." Weak. The word stuck to him like an accusation, reminding him of everything he had tried to escape. For the first time, Nathaniel saw what his father truly thought of him. Not as a person, not as his son, but as an object, a tool to be used for the family's image. Olivia had shown him the truth, and now it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. Meanwhile, Olivia was caught in the middle of the storm. She had always known the world she lived in, the world of hard work and striving for something better, but she had never expected it to collide with the high society that Nathaniel inhabited. The whispers in the kitchen, the disapproving glances from her fellow staff members, they all pointed to one thing. Olivia didn't belong here. But she didn't care about that. What she cared about was Nathaniel. What she had found in him wasn't just the son of a billionaire. It was a person who had been hurt, who had been told for years that he wasn't enough. And now, she had a choice to make. Stay in her place, or risk everything for the chance at something real. She could feel the pressure building, too. It wasn't just Nathaniel's world that was closing in on them. It was her own. Her job, her education, everything she had worked for was on the line. And for what? For a fleeting moment of connection with a man who was so far beyond her reach, a man who could never truly be hers. But despite the pressure, despite the fear, Olivia couldn't back down. The way Nathaniel looked at her, the way he trusted her in a world where he had no reason to trust anyone, she couldn't turn away from that. Not now. Not when she was starting to feel something for him. Something that went beyond her responsibilities as a waitress or a student. That night, as Olivia left the ballroom, her heart heavy with the weight of the decisions ahead, she caught one last glimpse of Nathaniel. He was standing by the window, staring out at the city lights, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His posture was stiff, resigned. She wanted to call out to him, to remind him that they could face this together, but she knew, deep down, that the choice wasn't hers to make. Nathaniel had to decide if he was willing to lose everything. His father's approval, his inheritance, his future, for a chance at something real. But as Olivia walked away, her resolve solidified. She wasn't about to let him go without a fight. She would stay in his world, if only to make sure he didn't have to live in silence anymore. The weight of Robert Ward's presence in the room was suffocating. The polished oak desk between father and son seemed to widen the gap between their worlds, the generational divide clearer than ever before. Nathaniel sat across from his father, his shoulders tense, his hands clasped tightly together. The walls of Robert's office, filled with portraits of Ward Enterprises' achievements and framed corporate accolades, seemed to mock the conversation that was about to unfold. Robert's steely gaze bore into Nathaniel, his posture rigid, his fingers tapping lightly on the polished surface of the desk, as if composing his words with precision. "I've given you everything, Nathaniel. I've built this empire for you to inherit, a legacy that's been passed down through generations. And this is how you repay me?" His voice was cold, calculating, with a thin veneer of disappointment. Nathaniel swallowed hard, the familiar knot in his stomach tightening. He knew what was coming, knew at the moment his father's eyes flickered toward him during the gala, a look of silent accusation. The simple act of being himself, of speaking his truth with Olivia, had unraveled everything Robert had carefully constructed. And now, Robert was coming to claim it all back. "I don't know what you mean," Nathaniel said, his voice lower than he intended, his words careful. He couldn't bring himself to meet his father's gaze for long. Robert leaned forward, the sharp edge of his presence filling the room. "You know exactly what I mean. I've seen you with her, Nathaniel. This waitress. This distraction." His voice grew colder with each word. "I told you before, this behavior is unacceptable. She is beneath you. She is a liability. Do you understand?" Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest. The walls that had once protected him, that had allowed him to hide behind silence, were now closing in on him from all sides. This was more than just his father's disapproval. This was the control Nathaniel had feared, the kind that could shape the rest of his life. "I don't see her that way," Nathaniel said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "Olivia doesn't see me as a project to be fixed. She treats me like a person. For the first time, someone actually sees me." Robert's eyes hardened, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I don't see you, Nathaniel? I've spent my entire life making sure you had everything you needed. And this is how you repay me? You've become a laughingstock in the eyes of people who matter. Do you want to lose everything I've worked for just to satisfy some naive whim?" Nathaniel felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of defiance. His whole life had been shaped by his father's ambitions, by Robert's need for control. Nathaniel had always been his pawn, his silent heir, his perfect son. But Olivia had offered him something different, something that felt real, something that had made him feel human again. "You don't understand," Nathaniel said, his voice firm now, though his heart raced. "I'm not just some extension of your business. I'm not just the Ward name. I'm a person, and I won't be ashamed of that anymore." Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He paced behind his desk, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you. This is about our name, our legacy. If you continue down this path, if you insist on associating with people like her, you'll lose everything. Your architectural project? Gone. The connections you've worked so hard for? Gone." Nathaniel felt the pressure of his father's words, but something inside him refused to give in. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had a choice. He could either continue to live a lie and appease his father, or he could choose to be free, to choose the life he wanted, one with Olivia, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. "I can't live like this anymore," Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "I won't." Robert's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. "You're making a mistake, Nathaniel. A huge one." He moved back around the desk, placing both hands flat on the wood, his gaze unwavering. "If you don't end this, if you don't sever your ties with Olivia right now, I'll pull the financial backing for your projects. I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. You'll be nothing without the Ward name, and I'll make sure she is too." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. He knew his father wasn't bluffing. Robert had the power to destroy him. He had always known that. But in this moment, the thought of returning to the life his father had scripted for him seemed suffocating. He would be living in a gilded cage, forever trapped in a legacy he hadn't chosen. "I'm sorry, Father, but I can't." Meanwhile, Olivia was facing her own battle. As she entered the staff room, she saw her boss Mark standing by the door, his arms crossed, his face set in a grim expression. His gaze fell on her with a sharp, disapproving look. "Olivia," Mark said, his tone low but firm. "We need to talk." She stopped in her tracks, feeling her stomach tighten. "What's going on?" "You've been spending a lot of time with Nathaniel Ward," Mark said, his eyes narrowing. "You're making people uncomfortable. You're crossing boundaries. This isn't your world. You need to stay in your place." Olivia's chest tightened. She had heard the whispers, seen the subtle glances, but hearing them spoken aloud made them real. She had known this was coming, the warning that she had gone too far. But she wasn't about to back down. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Olivia said, her voice steady despite the apprehension swirling inside her. "Nathaniel's a person, not a celebrity or a project. I'm not going to stop talking to him just because it makes you or anyone else uncomfortable." Mark stepped forward, his face hardening. "You're risking your job, Olivia. Do you really want to throw everything away over this? If you keep this up, you'll be out of here. Is he really worth it?" Olivia met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment. She could either walk away or stand firm, risking everything for something that felt real. "I'm not walking away," Olivia said, her voice low but unwavering. "I've worked too hard to get where I am. And Nathaniel, he's worth it." The weight of both Robert's demands and Mark's warnings pressed on them, but neither Nathaniel nor Olivia was ready to give up. For the first time in their lives, they were both standing on the edge of something real, something that could change everything, and they would face the consequences together. The gala was everything Nathaniel had expected. An elegant, meticulously orchestrated affair filled with the city's elite. The ballroom shimmered under the glint of crystal chandeliers, the atmosphere thick with the weight of wealth and power. Guests in impeccable attire sipped champagne, their laughter laced with insincerity, their conversations revolving around deals, numbers, and names that would never truly mean anything. It was a world of masks, of facades, and Nathaniel had always been a master at wearing his. But tonight, Nathaniel had made a decision. As the evening wore on, the orchestra played its familiar melodies, and the conversation hummed around him. Nathaniel stood in the back of the room, his eyes locked on the podium. He knew what was coming: the inevitable speech, the applause, the acknowledgement of his father's latest success. Robert Ward, as always, would take center stage, basking in the adoration of the crowd. But this time, Nathaniel felt something stir within him. He had been the silent son for too long. He had lived in the shadow of his father's expectations, his every move dictated by the need to be perfect, to be the heir the Ward legacy demanded. But now, for the first time, he was standing at the precipice of his own future, a future that didn't involve pretending to be someone he wasn't. The voices around him blurred as Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest. His father, standing at the podium with his usual commanding presence, looked over at him, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if expecting him to follow the script. Nathaniel could feel the weight of Robert's gaze, the unspoken pressure. But tonight, Nathaniel was done following anyone's script. As the applause began for Robert's latest triumph, Nathaniel felt a surge of clarity. He had to act now. He had to make a choice: either stay silent,
remain invisible in his father's world, or step forward and declare his own independence. Olivia had shown him a world where he could be more than just an heir, more than just a shadow of his father's legacy. She had shown him what it meant to truly be seen. And now, it was his turn to make that declaration to the world. With a deep breath, Nathaniel began to walk toward the podium. The room fell into a brief silence as people noticed his movement, but none of them seemed to understand the significance. They were all so used to him standing quietly, obediently, at the sidelines. But tonight, he wasn't going to fade into the background. When he reached the podium, he stopped, his back straight, his heart thudding in his chest. Robert's gaze was fixed on him now, a mixture of confusion and disapproval in his eyes. The crowd murmured, unsure of what to expect. Nathaniel didn't give them the chance to question. He reached up and, without a word, removed his hearing aids. The sharp click of the device hitting the table echoed in the room, but Nathaniel didn't flinch. For the first time in his life, he was making a conscious choice to step away from the world his father had built for him. The world where silence was a barrier, where his deafness was something to hide, to overcome, to fix. The room fell into a stunned hush. Nathaniel stood there, alone at the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd. His fingers twitched at his sides, unsure for a moment how to begin. But then, he remembered the comfort he had found in Olivia, the way she had never judged him, never tried to change him. She had simply accepted him, spoken to him in a language that made sense to him, a language that didn't require him to pretend. He took a step forward, his body language strong, confident. His hands began to move, the fluid motions of American Sign Language filling the space between him and the audience. Each sign he made was a declaration of independence, of authenticity, of freedom.
He signed slowly, his movements deliberate but filled with raw emotion. I am not a project to be fixed. I am not the person you want me to be. His hands moved with intensity. For years, I've lived in the shadow of an image that isn't mine. I've been told what to think, what to say, how to act. I've been told that my silence makes me weak. but I refuse to live in silence anymore. Nathaniel's gaze shifted, finding Olivia standing at the back of the room. Her eyes were wide, her expression unreadable, but he could feel her presence like a lifeline. She had been the one to see him, to hear him, when no one else had. He continued, his hands moving more confidently now. I choose to embrace who I am. I choose my silence as a voice. I choose to be seen, not for the name I carry, but for the man I am. And I choose Olivia, because she has shown me what it means to be human, to be free. His words hung in the air, each one more powerful than the last. The silence in the room deepened, almost suffocating, as the crowd tried to process what had just unfolded. Robert's face was a study in disbelief. He stood there, mouth slightly agape, unable to fully grasp what his son had just done. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and Nathaniel had just burned every bridge that connected him to it. The Ward legacy, the empire that Robert had built, no longer had a hold on his son. Nathaniel's fingers trembled as he signed his final words. I am not my father's son. I am my own person, and I choose to live on my terms. The crowd remained silent, processing the gravity of what Nathaniel had just declared. Some were shocked, others visibly uncomfortable. But Nathaniel didn't care. He had made his choice. The weight of years of silence, of playing the role he had been assigned, lifted from his shoulders. He stepped back from the podium, his eyes never leaving Olivia. She had seen him for who he truly was, and now the world would too. He had chosen her. Chosen authenticity over legacy, love over wealth, and for the first time in his life, Nathaniel felt truly free. As he walked toward Olivia, the press cameras flashed, the reporters swarming to capture the moment. But Nathaniel, for the first time, didn't care about the spotlight. He didn't care about the legacy his father had tried to force upon him. All that mattered was the woman waiting for him, the woman who had seen him in a way no one else ever had. Olivia's eyes met his as he reached her, and without a word, he took her hand. In that silent exchange, Nathaniel knew this was the beginning of something new. A life on his own terms. A life where he could be seen, heard, and loved. The days following Nathaniel's declaration were a blur of emotions. Freedom, excitement, relief, and a touch of fear. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of the Ward family legacy lift off his shoulders, replaced by something more intangible but far more precious: authenticity. The oppressive expectations, the ceaseless pressure to conform, had faded into the background, and in its place was a quiet, peaceful determination. He no longer felt trapped by the life his father had planned for him, no longer a pawn in the family's game of wealth and status. Nathaniel was free to choose his own path. And that path, he knew, was one that included Olivia. Together, they would carve out a future, free from the gilded cage of their past lives. For Olivia, the transition had been equally profound. The weight of her job, the judgment from her peers, the fear of losing everything. She had carried those burdens for so long. But Nathaniel's quiet courage had given her the strength to push past her own fears. Now, standing beside him, she no longer felt like an outsider. She felt like she belonged, like she was part of something real and unbreakable. The two of them settled into a life that felt more genuine, more authentic than anything they had known before. Their days began with simple, shared moments: a breakfast in their small apartment, quiet mornings spent reading or signing to each other.
the absence of words replaced with the comfort of their mutual understanding. In their silence, they had found a deep connection that needed no explanation, no validation from the world. They had built a sanctuary together, a world where their love didn't need to fit into the mold that society expected. Nathaniel would never forget the first time they sat together, on the small couch in their living room, each of them holding a cup of coffee, not speaking a word, but communicating more than words ever could. He had looked at Olivia, her face illuminated by the soft morning light streaming through the window, and felt the weight of everything he had given up. The empire, the expectations, the life he had been born into, was worth it. Just for this. Just for her. Olivia, too, found comfort in this new life. She had always worked hard, balancing her education with her job, but now, with Nathaniel by her side, she felt more grounded than ever. They supported each other in ways that were simple yet profound. When Nathaniel was struggling with a new architectural design, Olivia would be there, offering a quiet smile, a touch of reassurance. When she had to juggle late-night study sessions and her work shifts, Nathaniel would silently be by her side, his presence a constant, steady support. As the weeks passed, Nathaniel began to focus on his own dreams that had always been buried beneath the weight of his father's expectations. He had always loved architecture, not the kind that built towering monuments of wealth and status, but the kind that could change the world, the kind that could give people a place to call home. He wanted to build something that was for everyone, not just for the privileged few. Sustainable, affordable housing, spaces that were built to last, that were inclusive and accessible, not designed to impress or flaunt wealth. Nathaniel's decision to leave Ward Enterprises wasn't an easy one. He had built a career in the firm, had been promised the world, but that world had never been his. It had always belonged to his father. So he made a bold decision. He would start his own architectural firm, one that would focus on creating projects that mattered, not just in the realm of the elite, but for everyone. It was daunting at first, the thought of building something from scratch without the security of his father's empire behind him. But with Olivia by his side, he found the strength to push forward. They began to look at old, neglected buildings in the city, abandoned spaces that could be repurposed and transformed into homes for those who had nowhere to turn. Nathaniel's designs were bold, unconventional, but they were grounded in a deep sense of purpose. He wasn't just designing buildings. He was designing a future where everyone, regardless of their background, could have a safe, sustainable place to live. Olivia, too, was moving forward. She continued her studies, determined to finish what she had started. Her degree in speech pathology was something she had worked hard for, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone get in the way of her success. She had always wanted to help people, to make a difference, and now, with Nathaniel's support, she felt more confident than ever in her ability to do just that. One evening, after a long day of work and study, Olivia sat across from Nathaniel at their small dining table, a pile of architectural plans scattered between them. She looked at him, her eyes filled with quiet admiration. "I can't believe how far we've come," she said, her voice soft but full of meaning. "I never thought I'd be here, building a future with someone like you." Nathaniel smiled, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I never thought I'd be here either. But somehow, it feels like we're exactly where we're meant to be." There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations. Just two people who had chosen to build something real, something that mattered. In their quiet moments, in their shared dreams, they had found a life that was their own. A life without the chains of expectation. A life without the weight of the past. Nathaniel looked at Olivia, his heart full. "We're just getting started," he said, his voice steady, sure of the path ahead. And together, we're going to make a difference. Not just for us, but for everyone. Olivia squeezed his hand, her smile wide, her heart as full as his. She didn't need the approval of anyone else. She had everything she needed in this moment, in Nathaniel, in the life they were building, and in the future they would create together. For the first time, Nathaniel felt at peace with his choices. No longer bound by his father's empire. No longer silenced by the expectations of the world around him. He had found his own voice. And with Olivia by his side, he knew they could face anything. This was their new beginning. And it was more than he had ever dreamed of. The city was alive with the hum of possibility as Nathaniel and Olivia walked side by side, hand in hand. It was a crisp evening, the first hint of autumn in the air, but neither of them noticed the chill. They had both been through enough to know that warmth didn't come from the outside. It came from within. And, in that moment, with their fingers intertwined, there was no place they would rather be. Their relationship had deepened in ways neither of them could have imagined when they first met in the grand ballroom. From the moment Nathaniel had stepped forward and declared his independence, their connection had blossomed. Slowly at first, like a tender bud opening to the light. But as time passed, it had grown into something stronger, more resilient. It wasn't just a love born of passion, but of understanding and mutual respect.
They had learned to speak to each other in ways words could never convey. Olivia had found herself, for the first time, fully seen. Not as a waitress, not as a student fighting to make ends meet, but as a woman, vulnerable and strong, imperfect and authentic. Nathaniel, too, had discovered what it meant to live without the constant pressure of his father's expectations, without the invisible chains that had bound him for so long. With Olivia's presence in his life, he had found peace, not just in her love, but in his own voice. He no longer felt the need to apologize for who he was or for the choices he had made. Their worlds were still different, undeniably so. Nathaniel had come from privilege, a legacy of wealth that had shaped his every move before Olivia had shown him a different way. Olivia had grown up in a world where every step forward had been hard-earned, where nothing came without a price. And yet, as they faced the challenges of their respective worlds, they learned that true connection didn't come from wealth or status. It came from the willingness to be vulnerable and authentic with each other. There were moments of doubt, of course. There were times when the weight of their differences would press down on them, and Nathaniel would feel the familiar sting of isolation. Even with everything he had achieved, there were still times when he felt like an outsider in his own family, his father's disapproval hanging like a dark cloud. Robert Ward's cold silence still echoed in his life, a constant reminder of the empire that Nathaniel had left behind. His relationship with his father had become strained beyond repair, and there were moments when Nathaniel would wonder if he had made the right choice. But those moments were fleeting, because every time his thoughts strayed into the past, Olivia's presence would pull him back to the present, to the life they were building together. The love they shared didn't need to be validated by anyone else. It was theirs. And that was enough. Olivia, too, had her moments of uncertainty. She had never been part of the world Nathaniel had come from, never been part of the glamorous life that came with his name, his family's legacy. At first, she had felt like an imposter, like she was playing a role that didn't belong to her. But with Nathaniel, she felt seen, not for the job she had or the struggles she faced, but for the woman she was. Nathaniel had shown her that love wasn't about the things you had or the image you projected. It was about trust, honesty, and the willingness to embrace each other's imperfections.
One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their modest apartment, the city lights twinkling below them, Nathaniel turned to Olivia with a softness in his eyes that she had come to cherish. "I never thought I could feel this at peace," he said, his voice quiet but full of meaning. Olivia smiled, her fingers gently tracing the outline of his hand. "Me neither," she replied, her voice steady. "I used to think that the only way to get ahead in life was through success, through status. But now, I realize that the only thing that truly matters is this: us. We don't need anything else." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've spent so long running from who I am, trying to live up to someone else's idea of who I should be. But with you, I don't have to hide anymore." The words felt heavy with truth, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared understanding filling the space between them. Their relationship wasn't perfect. There would be challenges, obstacles they would have to face, like the constant shadow of Robert's disapproval, or the quiet judgment that still lingered in some corners of their lives. But as long as they had each other, Nathaniel knew that nothing could break the foundation they had built. The next day, Nathaniel walked into the office of his new architectural firm, his heart pounding with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. The office was small, the walls bare except for a few inspirational quotes and architectural sketches, but it was his. It was his vision, his dream taking shape before his eyes. He walked to his desk, placing his briefcase down with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The world outside still expected him to be his father's heir, to live up to the name that had been passed down to him. But here, in this space, he was Nathaniel Ward, the architect, the creator, the man who had chosen a different path. As he sat down at his desk, he thought of Olivia, how she had helped him see the truth of who he was, how she had never once asked him to be anything other than himself. The life they were building together was not about the riches or the status that came with his name. It was about the freedom to live authentically, to love freely, and to choose a path that made them both happy. Nathaniel smiled to himself, his eyes flicking toward the window, where the city sprawled out before him. For the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, standing beside the woman he loved, embracing the life they had chosen. Together, they had created something that spoke louder than any wealth, louder than any family legacy, something that was all their own. As the door opened and Olivia walked in with her usual warm smile, Nathaniel knew one thing for certain. Their love was the greatest thing he had ever built, and it spoke louder than anything else ever could.